The conversation you are about to hear is part of a project aiming to address rising illiberal tendencies in Slovenia from EU perspective and perspective of EU values, human rights, rule of law, free media, democracy. My name is Nataša Briški. I'm a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Meta's List, and with me is
Aljaž Pengov, Bitenc, blogger, editor, and journalist with daytime job being managing Radio Chaos in Ljubljana, Slovenia.
So Aljaž, we spoke like several times this year on the topics that I mentioned. We're trying to reach experts from various parts of Europe to talk about these things. It's very important due also to the events in the past year and a half in Slovenia. So with us again, we have Jamie Wiseman. Jamie, hi.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me on again.
We hosted you, I believe it was February this year. We spoke about the freedom of the media and the state of the media in European Union. I mean, you are an advocacy officer focusing on Europe at the International Press Institute. Now, for a start, can you tell us a little bit about the institution that you work for?
Sure. The International Press Institute, it's a global media freedom organization based in Vienna. And for the last 70 years, we've been defending the freedom of the press and media and independent journalism all around the world. We're the world's oldest journalism association of this kind. Over those last few decades, we've looked at issues in every region, every country of the world, following the kind of trends and changes through politics, and changes to society, changes to the way journalism is done and consumed as well. So we're a network-based organization with members all around the world, and we have our executive board, which is made up of kind of top editors-in-chiefs, including people like Maria Ressa, who obviously just won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and others like her. Our core mission is to defend independent journalism wherever it's threatened. And as you said, my focus is on Europe, and in Europe we work as part of a consortium, the Media Freedom Rapid Response, which was set up two years ago now with the idea of unifying the voice and the work of different media freedom organizations in Europe to speak in one voice, to advocate and support on issues in a kind of streamlined way, and to really kind of focus in on issues within Europe.
Jamie, sadly, it's stating the obvious to say that attacks on the journalists, on media outlets, on the press in general are getting more and more frequent as the time goes by. But would it be possible to make a connection? Is there a broader theme to all of it? I mean, things are happening in Western or in Southern Europe. A lot of attention is concentrated on the Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Yet it seems a mistake to take every single incident just as an incident unto itself. Is there a wider theme that's being that's being presented here?
Well, I think that the health of media freedom and the environment for independent journalism in whatever country it is always connected to political trends, and I think that's something we've always seen, not just in Europe but around the world. And if we look at what some of those trends are within Europe over the last decade, it's rising illiberalism, a kind of populist model that's been created and then kind of shifted and morphed and transformed to other countries. Media freedom has been put under strain by this model, which I think we see spreading. There are other issues as well in terms of threats to free media and media ownership by economic issues as well, in terms of how news is consumed. And there are much bigger global issues there that I think all have an impact on the day-to-day lives of journalists, the media outlets that they work for, and the kind of wider system for the free press in Europe.
As I mentioned, Jamie, we spoke about 10 months ago, in February. Like in your view, because you have like the view for the whole European Union insight, and you're working on these issues, would you say you're optimistic regarding the state of free media, freedom of the media?
I mean, yeah, it's important to note, obviously, that Europe, as any issue in Europe, media freedom in Europe is marked by difference and disparity amongst different countries. Overall, Europe is still the most free, the most independent region in the world for the freedom of the media in terms of journalists' rights, the healthiness of the investment climate, these kinds of issues. The EU has some of the best countries in the world for media freedom. If we're looking at the Baltic, the Scandinavian states, Finland, they're ranking number 1, number 2, number 3, always on the press freedom index. And yet we also have inside the EU bloc states which are ranking, below 100 and incredibly low and continuing to drop. So there are massive differences, and it's somewhat strange to think that they can exist within the same, regional bloc, the same democratic architecture. There can be such differences between kind of and a lot of that difference is post-communist states to others that have had a longer kind of democratic history as well. I think that's a key dividing line, although that doesn't mean that every single post-communist state is like that. We have seen some remarkable improvements and transformations, but obviously right now we're looking at Hungary and Poland about that model and where the biggest challenges are coming from. So in terms of whether I'm optimistic, it works both ways. We see incredible models of success, but also models of real issues. And sadly, over the last kind of 20 to 30 years, in terms of a democratic decline globally and within Europe, I think that trend of media freedom mirrors that kind of downward spiral, which is concerning. And it's that model which seems to be spreading more than the success or healthy model of media ownership and government ways of interacting and dealing with independent journalism in their countries. So I think there is cause for optimism, but also real cause for concern.
You mentioned even the business, or rather ownership aspect of pressuring the media outlets, and it would seem that in several countries, off the top of my head, Hungary, perhaps Slovenia, Macedonia, should I say North Macedonia, the conflagration between the political side and the economic side seems to be to create the most potent version of this attack on media outlets and on journalists, where economic interests are then interwoven with political interests, and then they serve needs of one particular political strain of political thought, if you will. And there seems to have been, in the last couple of years, this seems to have been a one-way street. Is there, is there a way back from the oligarchic and politically controlled media outlets that we've seen you mentioned Poland, Hungary, North Macedonia, and increasingly in Slovenia?
I mean, the freedom of the media is always deeply connected to ownership of the press. I think it's one of the key elements. And if, in a lot of countries, oligarchical control over key newspapers and media outlets is deeply entrenched. Even in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, the situation's been very dire for a long, long time. Post-independence in a lot of kind of post-Soviet states, there was a great improvement in terms of pluralism, in terms of media ownership, in terms of the country opening up and investment from publishers, well-known publishers from Germany, France, Switzerland, and overall we saw a real increase in the standards, professionalism, democratization. But again, as democracy has become within the retreat in a lot of these countries again, those old forms and manners of control have started to kind of reintegrate themselves. And a lot of that comes from owners who own a lot of these newspapers, who often have cross business interests, who see and understand newspapers as something for buying and peddling their interest or supporting their other businesses, and that has a really damaging and detrimental effect on independent journalism. So I think, yeah, you're right to say that those two things are deeply connected. And in terms of whether there's a way back, there are key cases where, newspapers or online outlets which are threatened by hostile ownership have, core journalist teams and newsrooms have broken away and set up their own newspapers again. There are cases where really damaging owners have been forced out, and more respectful owners have come in. But sadly, I think those cases are in the exception. I'm thinking in Hungary of Index, which was one of the leading independent outlets, which then faced meddling and pressure from people linked to the government, business allies and oligarchs. And the team broke away after the newspaper imploded and have now established one of the most trusted independent news outlets in the country. And that happened through crowdsourcing and readers, donating directly. So I think there are models of how this ownership issues can be solved. And there are also, very ethical investors from the United States, from Germany, who can come in if a newspaper is sold and really reconstruct that barrier which should always be there between ownership and the newsroom. So again, I think there is cause for optimism, but again, I would agree that the trend is probably going in the other way right now.
You red flagged some of the countries where the question of the media freedom may be in danger, or in some countries such as Hungary, they're not even talking about the media freedom in the same sentence anymore. Could you describe the nature of the attacks that mostly news organizations and the media face?
Well, I think there are obviously issues in every country around journalist safety. That's a key issue. There are issues around lawsuits and slaps against journalists, strategic lawsuits against public participation. There are those consistent issues which can come from individual citizens, from protests, from businessmen. But then there are kind of the bigger issues which come state-directed, which come directly from governments, which come in and want to kind of manipulate the media system in their favor. And we've seen in the last decade, I would say, a kind of key model created. Elements are taken from Erdogan in Turkey. Before that, of course, Putin from Russia. But it's really been pioneered within the democratic architecture of the EU by Fidesz and the Orban government in Hungary, and then copied in other countries like Poland. And we've really identified kind of four key elements to this model. The first involves attempts to kind of disparage, demonize, and divide the journalistic community, dividing the journalistic community down ideological or political lines, and portraying people and journalists critical of the government as foreign agents, people funded by nefarious business interests, or unpatriotic people. And with that divide created, then you can kind of hold up pro-government media, those supportive of the government, as patriotic. The second element, I think, would be control over public service media, which have always been the low-hanging fruit, always easiest to control by a government because of they're funded by public money, which government has control over. You can also have control over the oversight bodies, which are controlling the budgets or the hiring and firing of the director general. In Hungary and Poland, we've seen both public broadcasters deformed into propaganda outlets, which are completely biased against opposition candidates, and really don't serve the public good, rather the party good. And then I think the third part of the model is control over the system of regulation of media within a country. Again, pioneered in Hungary, where regulatory bodies, which would rule broadcast regulators, media regulators, Fidesz has been very successful in planting its own people in those bodies, who then use majorities to make decisions against normal kind of principles of fairness and non-discrimination. This is used to kind of silence outlets, to cancel broadcast licenses, to stack the deck essentially against independent journalism, which is critical and fulfilling a watchdog role. And then the fourth key element involves media capture. This is the most important and, if you're a government, most sought after element of the model, which in Hungary again has been deeply effective over the last decade in really having business oligarchs and allies of the government step in and buy up independent media. This was the hostile ownership we were talking about, where media outlets that either are kind of already in a weakened position or weakened even more through government pressure on international investors, then retreat from the country and leave a vacuum into which friendly oligarchs can step, buy up newspapers or media outlets, and then slowly purge them of really critical journalists, make changes to management positions, and slowly over a matter of months flip the editorial line or sell it or donate it to in Hungary this Kezma Foundation, which is a kind of media conglomerate. So that's the key issue. And again, in Poland, we've seen attempts at similar takeover by friendly actors to the government of key independent newspapers and television stations as well. So that model has been very successful in those countries. And because we see a lack of action from the European Union or very slow response to dealing with it, I think we've seen the model spread across European borders in recent years because of its success and because of its ability to work within the gray areas of the law. It's specifically complex by design and works within the democratic framework and legal framework of the European Union. And part of that, of course, is having courts which are non-independent as well, which can, when challenged, when regulatory decisions are challenged or other issues are challenged, rule in the favor of the government as well. So all of these things kind of fit together. That really kind of shows that if the legal framework is not free and not independent, then media freedom is really jeopardized.
So we're actually talking about an intersection of media freedom and the rule of law and the division of power between the three branches. And I would imagine, comparing the situations across Europe, that the pure raw political power plays a role as well. I mean, in comparison, Slovenia, with its proportional electoral system and currently minority right-wing government, has seen the same sort of attacks, yet much less successful. There was much more pushback. So, I mean, is there for the lack of a better word, proper sequence of these steps that results in overall media and state capture, or is there something else at play?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not a perfect model. There are elements which can work in different varieties, but yeah, I think for complete control, it would require all four. And while they sometimes work in kind of sequence, or around the same time, there are some countries which, because of this, a lack of a supermajority like Fidesz would have, or because of the lack of pressure from the EU, because a country was considered a safe haven for media, there's not quite as much attention or concern, or it would be dependent on the strength of opposition or civil society to push back. These attempts at undermining independent journalism can be very successful in some countries and not so successful in others. If we turn to Slovenia, I think there was already a very healthy system for media freedom. It was always ranked in, I think, the top 20 in the Media Freedom Index. Not to say that there, of course, were not challenges, significant challenges. There were, but there was a stronger democratic feeling in the country, I think, previous efforts to really kind of systematically manipulate the media system had been relatively relatively ineffective, I would say. Of course, it doesn't always work in tandem, and some countries can have very, very different systems.
We are mostly mentioning Poland and Hungary. I was just wondering, listening to what all you said and thinking of the press freedom missions to Slovenia from the EU Parliament and some unfortunate episodes our Prime Minister had with the EU Parliament, how high on the agenda of IPI is Slovenia?
Increasingly high, I think. Before Slovenia, for IPI and many other media freedom organizations, would not have been a country to worry about. But over the last year and however many months, 10 months, 11 months, we've seen it really come onto the agenda because of seeing those kind of those elements of attack that I just described replicated in Slovenia in terms of division of a journalistic community, in terms of reaching for or exerting greater control over public media, both at RTVS and of course the Slovenian press agency, which has been under extreme financial pressure, as well as smears and attempts to undermine its professionalism and discredit its work. So we've seen both of those elements, and then as well, increasing concerns about efforts to increase Hungarian business and media ownership within Slovenia. A lot of the investment that's come in, for relatively small media actors in the market, it must be said, but still, these investments are coming from companies within the Kejma Foundation, which are very much linked to that Orban kind of network, which is concerning. And it means, that independent journalism will be weakened, I think. I think Slovenia is increasingly concerning, and that has been noticed, I think, at the European level as well. We've had many discussions with MPs, with the Libe committee, who have put out statements. Obviously, we've seen in plenary sessions, Slovenia injected into a debate where it never really would have been before, in terms of media freedom, in terms of democracy, even in terms of rule of law as well. As we've said, all those issues are connected. And I think, NGOs, organizations, and European bodies which look at rule of law have also had to think about Slovenia for the first time in a while. At the Commission level as well, I think we've seen the current Values and Transparency Commissioner, Vera Jourova, really focus on the case of Slovenia and start to understand, which I think previous commissioners have not done quite so well, that the longer the EU allows these attacks on media freedom to continue in Hungary, to then switch to Poland, to then continue to spread, that they'll continue to spread to other countries as well. There have been discussions around the Media Freedom Act, and discussions around legislating against slaps, trying to create emergency stopgaps and emergency breaks for regulatory decisions in country which negatively affect media freedom. So I think there is a renewed understanding about the threats to media freedom in Europe from the Commission and the Parliament, and Slovenia is part of that concern now.
You've already partly answered my next question, but still, what can be done? I mean, obviously things are being done. There is pushback on various levels in various countries. There are even rare but existing positive cases. But on a country level, with their freedom to fair and information being endangered, what can the citizens do? What can the media outlets do? And ultimately, on an European or international level, what more can be done? I understand advocacy groups have a role to play. I understand the EU has a role to play, but obviously more needs to be done. What?
That's the big question. I think at the citizen level, support for a key understanding of the importance of independent journalism is vital. I think the support that we've seen for the STA in Slovenia was a good reminder of the strength of support for independent journalism there, and the want of citizens to have access to reliable and independent information. Paying for news, sadly, for citizens is a massive way that they can help support independent journalism. I know that's a switch from the entire model, the business model that was there before, but as we move into a digital age, when Facebook continue to hoover up advertising money, that is one of the best ways you can support independent journalism. From the media community itself as well, solidarity and support is important for those which are under pressure. I think we saw that in Slovenia as well, with a really great outpouring of support and emotion and solidarity from other media outlets for the STA, which of course is a real kind of lifeblood of the media ecosystem there. And then at the government level, of course, is absolutely key. Governments should work to foster and improve the situation and the climate for media freedom and media pluralism, which means fair, transparent, and visible support for media through public advertising, which is done in a fair way, non-interference, and non-stacking of the deck against independent journalism, keeping that barrier that should be there between political parties and media, and not polluting and corrupting independent courts and the rule of law as well has a massive effect. So there's much to be done there in terms of creating a solid legislative framework as well to protect journalists' rights, working with police and law enforcement to make sure that journalists are safe when it's attacks at protests, that things are investigated, those responsible for attacks are prosecuted. There's much to be done there. And then at the EU level, the big picture is that I think, honestly, a lot of people, lawmakers, people in Brussels never really considered that media freedom would be under the threat it was. They would always look at, okay, we have EU laws, individual member states have national laws. There should be a clear legal framework there which should protect us and stop against systematic regression. But it's turned out not to be the case because of the complexity and the wiliness of countries which would like to systematically undermine those principles and those values. So there's been a scramble over the last few years to understand where the gaps are in the EU, to understand how they can help. And as I said, part of that is legislating against slaps. The EU also published a kind of a recommendation in the Commission about the safety of journalists, outlining exactly what states have to be doing to improve the climate for safety. But that's of course nothing at an EU. That's not EU law. That's recommendations for states to implement at the national level. And then the big issue, where I think really reflects the strength of the concern, is this Media Freedom Act, which details on are still scarce. But our understanding is that the EU would like greater competencies at the Commission to be able to intervene in key cases where media freedom is threatened, to put an emergency brake on regulatory decisions, which would take an independent outlet off the air, or to scrap broadcast license, which would take them off television. Those kind of issues where there's a key and central issue for media freedom, because right now the EU has very little tools to be able to respond to those, other than pressure statements, missions to countries which are important. And we've seen many trips from different MPs and committees to Slovenia. We've met with the government, met with journalists, but there's only so much effectiveness that those can have. So a kind of key legislative effort with government, an EU directive, seems to be the next step down that line.
Thanks so much for talking about the situation in Europe with us. Is there, just for the final question from my part, are there any questions or issues that we should be looking at and we are not? Or what questions should we ask ourselves and we are not? Maybe too much in a bubble or something. What would you like us to pay attention to?
I think good question. Always, an understanding and an awareness of what's happening in other countries. Europe is relatively small if we think about it on the global scale. And a lot of the countries are so small, and it's easy in whatever country you're in to focus only on what's happening there. But I think there are key lessons that can be learned from looking at what's happened in Hungary, what's happened in Poland. Those are around media capture. But then there are other countries like Croatia where slaps and abusive lawsuits are really, really a major issue. There are lessons to be learned there. Talking to journalists in other countries, will always expand your experience and your understanding of what's going on and what pressures they face, and importantly, the similarities in the pressures that are being faced by journalists across the continent. So I think, that kind of information sharing and solidarity is always really, really important.
Okay.
Jamie Wiseman, International Press Institute. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.